The figure of the werewolf has, as Craig Ian Mann has argued, long been associated with the beast within, a view which emphasises the psychological dimension of werewolfism. Indeed, many representations of werewolves within cinema position the creature in terms of a human-bestial duality, and the condition of being a werewolf is viewed as an external expression of an internal struggle. This is partly and understandably the result of the influence that psychoanalysis had upon late 19th and early 20th century thinking, the period that saw the birth of cinema and, as a result, the horror film, and partly because, as Chantal Bougot de Coudray asserts, the werewolf lacked a generating text as famous as Mary Shelley's Frankenstein or Stoker's Dracula. Because of this lack of a lycanthropic urtext, it's not difficult to view many cinematic and literary representations of the werewolf as borrowing heavily from the conflicted figure of Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, perhaps the closest analogue within the literary period that gave birth to Frankenstein and Dracula. However, the idea of the werewolf has long been present within human history and mythology, from early modern Europe, where cases were often aligned with the witch hunt fervour, Norse berserkers who would wear wolfskins and gnaw their shields, the Arcadian king Lycon turned into a wolf by Zeus, and the epic of Gilgamesh, thought to be the oldest recorded story in human history, in which the goddess Ishtar turns a suitor into a wolf. These tales suggest the idea that the human turned wolf, or something in between, has returned to a pre-civilized state of behavior. However, it's equally important that the figure of the werewolf is expelled from civilization and returned to a pre-civilized space outside of the village, town, or city. Whilst technically a joint UK-US production, it's not difficult to think of An American Werewolf in London as being a British horror film, given it utilised a largely British production crew, featured a cast of almost entirely British actors, and most importantly, was concerned with British spaces. Certainly being directed by an American and featuring two American actors in prominent roles does not detract from the sense of Britishness that permeates the film. What is important is the way that an idea of Britain is filtered through John Landis's American sensibilities. Whilst Britain sits on the very western edge of Europe and has cultural peculiarities that mark it out as being very different to its continental cousins, for example, Britons are famously reserved in comparison, it is still a European country. And whilst Britons may or may not identify as Europeans as strongly as those nations not separated from the continent by water, an American may well have less difficulty viewing the UK as part and parcel of a larger idea of Europeanness. It's this European status that connects Britain to the werewolf mythos. The werewolf is very much rooted in European folklore, and it was the traditional practices that survived in particular areas of Europe that initially inspired Landis's script. He recounts the story of how, while serving as part of the production crew for Kelly's Heroes, he was being driven down a small road in the former Yugoslavia, and the vehicle he was in passed a gypsy funeral that, even in the Yugoslavia of 1968, seemed archaic. The gypsies took measures to ensure the deceased would not rise from the grave, and Landis described his feelings as, "You felt like you were on another planet. You really were removed." Landis adds that even his Yugoslavian driver found the scene to be remarkable and comedic, suggesting that it was a ritual particular not only to a group of people inhabiting a particular space, but also to a particular time. The fact that Landis was raised in the modernist city of Los Angeles clearly marked this superstitious behaviour as surreal and temporally disjointed. Indeed, the idea that different spaces can embody different stages of cultural development lends itself to an examination of the differences between the space of the rural and the space of the urban. So a brief synopsis. David and Jack, two American college students, are backpacking across Europe and find themselves in North Yorkshire on their way to more exotic European destinations. They are attacked by a werewolf. Jack is eviscerated, whilst David is scratched and bitten before the werewolf is shot by locals. David awakens in a London hospital and quickly falls in love with a nurse charged with his care. Nurse Alex invites David to stay with her, but it quickly becomes apparent that the wolf's curse has been passed on to David, who transforms over the course of 2 evenings and mutilates a host of Londoners before being shot by the police. What follows is an examination of the ways in which David internalizes the primitive space of the rural by virtue of his blood carrying the werewolf's curse. The degree to which David can be considered to experience London as an insider or an outsider is largely the result of 2 factors that ensure he is spatially dislocated. Firstly, his status as an American in England, and secondly, the fact that he is essentially a werewolf in waiting. In surviving the werewolf attack, he's simultaneously internalized the werewolf's curse and the space in which the werewolf was able to thrive, i.e. the rural. Whilst this internalization is an imposition upon David, the same can be said of the time he spends in London. Edward Relf states that character and meaning are imputed to landscapes by the intentionality of experience, and David is, after all, removed from the rural and into the city quite against his will. In addition, the death of his friend brings to an end his plans to travel from England to Rome and elsewhere. Therefore, he has no spatial expectations, the intentionality of experience regarding London, and indeed his idea of the city is the result of, firstly, his time spent within the hospital, and then time spent with Alex at her flat. His experiences within the city are therefore lacking in tension and are rather passively attained. To consider the first point, an American in England, David is essentially spatially and culturally distanced throughout the film. Initially, within the rural scenes, he's a city resident, entirely unaware of the traditions and dangers embedded into the rural. This point is reinforced when the same spatial naivety is true of Dr. Hirsch, the doctor treating David in the hospital, when he visits East Proctor to check out David's werewolf story. Then, during his stay in the hospital, David's cultural identity is the source of discussion amongst the nurses, as one nurse, Nurse Gallagher, tells Alex that she believes him to be a Jew, stating that she had a look, implying that she saw his presumably circumcised penis. Despite Alex informing Nurse Gallagher that this is a common procedure, there are other suggestions that David is Jewish. Both he and Jack use Yiddish insults such as schmuck and putz. And in a later dream sequence, David dreams that he's at home with his family when they're suddenly attacked and murdered by a group of creatures, at least one of which is werewolf-like in appearance, wearing Nazi uniforms. Matthew Beresford suggests that the appearance of these Nazi monstrosities is a comment on Hitler's links with the werewolf. Hitler identified with the figure of the wolf. The name Adolf is derived from an older German term, Athelwolf, meaning noble wolf. And as Chantal Bougot de Coudray attests, during the end days of the Third Reich, the Nazi military resuscitated the image of the werewolf, using the term as a name for the underground movement organized by fascist loyalists at the end of the Second World War. At this point in the narrative, David has been visited by the increasingly decomposing figure of Jack, who warns him that they were attacked by a werewolf, and that David's survival means that he too will become a werewolf during the next full moon. This dream, then, is an expression of David's subconscious fear of his impending monstrosity, and this is expressed in the image of Nazi monsters. The film was released in 1981, and the script had been drafted as early as 1969, so the horrors of the Holocaust were very much in living memory, and Landis is himself Jewish. For David, as a Jew, the Nazi are the most monstrous figure that his subconscious mind can draw upon, and their conflation with elements of the werewolf represent the inevitable transformation that he himself will suffer. Whilst David, being Jewish, is never negatively figured within the narrative, the dream sequence is best described by John Spira, writing about the identificatory impact the film and David's Jewishness had upon himself as a young Jewish viewer, when he says it embodies this primal fear that our new Western society could turn on us interlopers at any moment, systematically destroying us like animals while hatefully spitting on our culture. Whether overtly expressed within the film or not, David's Jewishness is clearly part of his foundational sense of identity, and it's one of the many elements at hazard because of his werewolf in waiting. This dream represents the final stage of an internal process in which David's dormant secondary identity subconsciously rejects any sense of belonging and insideness and fractures any sense of unity that he has, resulting in him becoming more and more spatially dislocated. The bleeding of the rural into David's internalized sense of identity is represented through a series of 4 dreams, each increasing in intensity. In the first of these dreams, we're presented with a camera POV, assumed to be that of a lupine creature, given its proximity to the ground, which seems to follow a desire line, an informal path made and maintained by successive travellers. Desire lines often indicate a preferred route across ground and usually denote a shortcut. It's probable that in this case, the informal path was simply easier for the camera to navigate, but it represents the very minimal presence of people within a landscape filled with trees and undergrowth, enough to have created a desire line, but not enough to necessitate a structural path. The second dream takes place in even deeper undergrowth, where a naked David is running and jumping over fallen branches and then stalking a deer before pouncing upon it, tearing off its head and biting into the flesh. The meaning is clear. David's werewolf in waiting is becoming an increasingly strong presence within his subconscious mind, and its desires are manifest within this dream. David's third dream sees him running through a forest, again dense with no paths or desire lines, wearing the clothes and backpack he wore when he was attacked by the werewolf. He wears an anguished look on his face, and there's a sense that he's running from something. The scene is reminiscent of the scene on the moors, in which David flees from the werewolf as Jack is slaughtered. And indeed, David is fleeing from his werewolf in waiting identity. He eventually comes to rest behind a tree where he watches another version of himself laying in his hospital bed. Nurse Alex Price approaches the bed, and as she smiles at David, he suddenly snarls, revealing bestial yellow eyes and large fangs. This dream clearly expresses a further strengthening of the burgeoning monstrosity hidden within David's psyche, symbolized by the duality of David watching himself and the stark contrast between the human observing the monster. However, these dreams do not simply represent a psychological binary between man and beast. The increasingly dense woodland that serves as the backdrop to these 3 dreams can be aligned with what Ralph describes as primitive space, the space of instinctive behavior and unself-conscious action, in which we always act and move without reflection. Whilst David and Jack were attacked on open moorland, the dense forest within the dream serves as a kind of earth space, the space in which the werewolf in waiting can thrive and behave in unself-conscious ways, as a counterpoint to the space of men, the city. David's final dream takes place within the family home and seems at first to be a memory, given its initial ordinariness in comparison to the previous rural dreams. Being somewhat traumatized by the nature of his dreams, David tells Dr. Hirsch that he would rather not be alone, and so Alex is assigned to watch over him. As a gesture of comfort, she offers to read to him, and as she does so, David drifts off to sleep. This scene transitions via a fade to David's family home. His younger brother and sister sit in front of the television watching The Muppet Show. His father reads a newspaper, his mother cleans dishes, and David sits at a table, busy with college work. Ralph describes this sort of domestic space as such, Home in its most profound form is an attachment to a particular setting, a particular environment, in comparison with which all other associations with places have only a limited significance. It is the point of departure from which we orient ourselves and take possession of the world. For Ralph, home is the foundational element of identity formation, and this final dream sees that profound attachment to space, to existential insideness, severed in the most forceful way possible. This scene of domestic stability is disrupted by an invasion perpetrated by Nazi monstrosities, symbolic of David's own impending monstrous becoming, who shoot David's family and slit his throat while simultaneously destroying the family home. His own internalized werewolf in waiting is clearly ready to absolve him of any sense of spatial stability he might have. To further punctuate this sense of spatial dislocation, Landis adds a coda to this dream. David apparently awakens after the destruction of his family home, and Alex is still watching over him in his hospital room. David tells her that he's just had a nightmare, to which she replies, "Not to worry, I've just a thing." She then opens his curtains to reveal one of the Nazi monstrosities, who proceeds to stab her repeatedly. David awakens from this dream within a dream with a not unreasonably exclamatory "holy shit." The appearance of this monstrosity, a token of David's werewolf in waiting within the hospital room, is the final bleeding of the internal into the external, what Andrew Tudor describes as the eruption of abnormality into a mundane setting that allows for the genre's most common means of narratively exploiting its physical environment. This final aspect of David's dreaming, the passage of the rural monster into the space of the city, heralds the literal eruption of David's werewolf in waiting into the space of London.